Florida also lacks a state labor department which combat wage theft, and we know that construction is an industry that sees one of the highest rates of not only child labor violations but also wage theft.
Which side are you on? Which side are you on?
Florida just ended its legislative session. Alabama is halfway through. It's halfway through. So we've got another full half of our legislative session to go.
Yes, unfortunately.
Unfortunately. But fortunately for Florida, theirs is over. So the damage for this year is done, and now we're going to assess it. And to help us assess the damage done to Floridians, we have McKenna Schueler, staff reporter for the Orlando Weekly. She's on the line right now, right?
She is, yes.
McKenna, welcome to the program. It's good to have you back.
Yeah, thanks so much for inviting me back.
It's great to have you. You do great work. And like I said this on Twitter, but I am not aware of a single other full-time reporter that does as much work in the labor space as you do, reporting on the activities of working people and specifically making pains to point out how legislation will affect working people, even where it's, politics, and other reporters might just kind of focus on the politics and the horse race stuff. You really do a lot to connect things that you're reporting on to the lives of working people and how it affects them. And I appreciate that. I really appreciate that a lot. And, working people in the South deserve a lot more reporters like you. And so I just wanted to say that at the top. And, to let you go on, to let you tell us what were the, like I said, the legislative session just ended. So what are the big takeaways? Give us kind of the big overview, and then we can go into a couple of the bills individually.
Yeah, so I kind of tried to focus on some of the big labor-related legislation that did pass this session, just because of the audience and such. So broadly speaking, I think there was a pretty eclectic slate of anti-labor bills this session. Last year, there was a sweeping bill targeting organized labor, specifically public sector unions, whereas this year, bills filed didn't just target organized labor, but also children, specifically minors 16 and older, as well as outdoor workers and working people in Florida who benefit from prevailing wage laws and other local laws known as living wage ordinances. So I feel like that'd be a great place to start if you're interested in that.
Yeah, let's start with the living wage ordinances. I actually, that's not one I was tracking. I was tracking the union bill, the one dealing with the public sector stuff. I was tracking the child labor laws and the outdoor heat and stuff like that. But I wasn't tracking anything affecting living wage ordinances. And so presumably the Florida legislature, because, they value autonomy and home rule and they value working people, they in fact, definitely allowed municipalities to set their own living wage ordinances and raise the minimum wage in Florida. Is that what happened?
Yeah, so so this is like something that has been pushed by the industry lobbyists for years, but that was the living wage ordinance preemption that was actually packaged into the bill with the preemption of the workplace heat standards. So what kind of happened there? That's House Bill 433, sponsored by Republican state representative, a first-term state rep, Tiffany Esposito, who is herself the president of a regional chamber of commerce. Oh. So that bill started out as the preemption bill to prevent city and county governments from establishing any kind of mandates on workplace heat exposure protections for outdoor workers like construction workers, farm workers. So it would ban anything that's stronger than what's already required under state or federal law, which isn't really much beyond some guidelines. And this bill was a direct attack on a local push in Miami-Dade County in South Florida, which was pushing for just that kind of policy, just really basic stuff like requiring shaded water breaks, providing instruction on heat illness prevention, honestly nothing super radical because it had to get watered down enough for local elected leaders to actually get on board. And that's because there was a lot of pressure from the industry side to trash it, and industry groups did actually end up managing to delay a vote on that, something like a week before this statewide bill was filed. Um, no other city or county has done that, so this was entirely preemptive, not gutting any policies in any local communities that already exist, because unfortunately they don't. And I don't think that was necessarily clarified in some of the national coverage, but obviously this just kind of prevents local governments from even trying.
Right.
But then what happened is that the bill's sponsor changed the legislation to make it a lot broader. And so in the end, what actually passed through a lot of amendments and chaos, especially in the last couple weeks of session, was that heat safety preemption, but also it would eliminate about a dozen local laws in places like Miami, known as living wage ordinances, that require companies profiting off government contracts to pay their workers something closer to a living wage in their communities. So Miami-Dade, I think, has one of the highest living wage requirements, like a minimum $18 or something. And this affects contracted workers at airports, janitorial and security employees. But it's honestly unclear how many workers it will affect because the bill's sponsor herself did not know. But it's expected to be probably like tens of thousands, just based on what we know of, especially those ordinances covering South Florida. And the bill was also changed last minute to preempt predictive scheduling. So basically to prevent any communities from fighting for fair work week laws, which actually isn't really a thing in Florida yet. And what these laws do in other communities across the country that have implemented them is just require employers to provide hourly workers, some of whom are working multiple jobs, to have their schedules a week or two in advance so they can essentially plan the rest of their lives and don't get called on to work the night before when they have kids to take care of or doctor's appointments, stuff like that. And as I mentioned, like this is something that has been pushed before, not specifically the heat exposure stuff, but the living wage ordinance preemption. And I think one compromise that really secured its passage specifically on the Senate side is that the wage and scheduling preemption, that specifically won't go into effect until September 30th, 2026, which is the exact date that Florida's $15 minimum wage is going to be fully effective as well, which is, that's under a ballot initiative that was passed by voters in 2020. So that's kind of like the broad strokes of that bill. Again, kind of like the sort of still a smaller, narrower version of the what was called the Death Star preemption bill that was passed in Texas last year. But one thing I've really been trying to keep an eye on throughout session on this bill and other bills is just where this legislation came from. And specifically with this bill, it's important to note that the Chamber of Commerce and other business lobbying groups have been really trying to do this for at least a couple of decades, similar to the anti-union bill passed last year. But this year's preemption, which really just kind of restricts the local governments, really kind of builds on a similar law passed in the early 2000s, I think, which did the same thing as far as forbidding the state or local governments from regulating at all the wages or benefits that private employers provide. And the exception there was private employers that contract with local governments, so government contractors. And that's exactly what this year's bill targeted. So essentially bosses that receive public taxpayer dollars that don't want to have to be forced to pay above Florida's minimum wage.
And you, yeah, well, and you mentioned the state minimum wage that passed as a ballot initiative. Did you say that they passed that this law also overturned that?
No, it doesn't. It's just I honestly don't know the reason behind it, but like the wage and scheduling preemption, it will go fully into effect on the same exact day that Florida is supposed to get its $15 minimum wage, because
Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, the 2020 ballot initiative, it kind of created a gradual process. So the minimum wage at that time was like $8.46 an hour. Then it rose to $10, and it's been rising $1 each since. So currently it's at $12. and it'll reach 15 by September 30th, 2026.
Okay, gotcha. Yeah, not good. And so, what were the?
Also very familiar to
Yes.
Alabama. We've
Yeah.
dealt with preemption as well. So yeah, it's unfortunate how this spreads from place to place.
How did they respond to arguments about how it might be worth having some sort of heat protections in Florida for working people? How did they respond to challenges to the bill?
I mean, supporters, which it was again kind of passed along party lines, I believe. There were some Republicans who ended up voting against it, particularly in South Florida, where it was going to be, it was just a major issue. But supporters pretty much just kind of pointed to like, oh, OSHA has guidelines, they have restrictions, employers can already be fined for, not taking care of their employees. And then the industry was arguing that lawmakers were essentially trying to signal that they weren't already taking care of their employees, so they felt kind of insulted, or at least that's how they presented themselves. So the trouble is enforcement in Florida with OSHA and with even the wage and hour stuff. There's very limited capacity to actually reach work sites. And I think the Miami Herald, for instance, reported that since 2020, there have been 5 Florida employers that have been fined by OSHA.
Wow.
And that was after workers died. So the fact that it has to kind of get to that point for employers to face any kind of consequence is something that was really troubling, understandably, for labor rights organizations, immigrant rights groups, because a lot of immigrants make up these workforces that are working outside. So that was very concerning and a big push for why they wanted to at least tried to do this in Miami-Dade.
Right.
That's bad. Hopefully we're gonna get some good news here in just a second. Child labor, that we've got good news there, right? The bill about child labor, they were protecting children more strongly. Is that what happened?
I would say that probably some people would argue that the legislation is it's definitely more protective from where it started, because it was significantly watered down because of all the public opposition that there was. But I guess one thing that was just, so there were 2 child labor related bills, 2 bills specifically amending what is literally under Florida statutes as child labor statutes. But one thing that I kind of found frustrating throughout this whole experience was that most of the media coverage has focused on one of the bills, House Bill 49, which was admittedly like just a more direct attack on child labor law, because that's pretty much all it did. Whereas the other bill, Senate Bill 460 or House Bill 917, which is what passed, that bill broadly concerns career and technical education programs in schools, but also just contains a small section that relaxes restrictions on the kinds of work that 16 and 17-year-olds can do on residential construction sites, directly affecting hazardous work restrictions under Florida's child labor statutes. So
that's slippery. Put it in the career tech bill.
Yeah, and it was, I think what's kind of scary, or I don't know if I should say that, but about that bill is that I think if there were a couple people like myself and Jason Garcia, who's an investigative reporter also based in Orlando, who has a newsletter, Seeking Rents, it's a Substack. We were a couple of the handful of reporters who kind of first caught it, but I think it would have been really easy to miss that, because the fact that it was packaged into this broader bill, that bill actually ended up getting quite a bit of bipartisan support. So on the Senate side, for instance, it was ultimately passed unanimously by both Republicans and Democrats. But
so what were the restrictions that were lifted on 16 and 17-year-olds in residential construction? What were the jobs that they could not do before that they can do now?
So, minors under 18 were specifically barred from just working on construction sites broadly, unless it was like sales or office jobs, or there's an exemption under child labor law in both state and federal law, I believe, for students who are employed in or not employed, but who are in student learner programs through like a school or apprenticeship programs. So there is a carve out there, but currently under law, since this new bill hasn't been signed into law yet, teenagers are barred from working most construction jobs, but this specifically kind of let 16 and 17-year-olds now work on residential construction sites. But it was watered down pretty significantly from where it started, to the point where that's when the media really started ignoring it again. And it made it clear that teens, for instance, would not be allowed to work on roofs, because under the bill as it was filed, it would have allowed teens 16 and older to work in commercial construction as well as residential. It also would have allowed them to work on superstructures, roofs, ladders, and scaffolding more than 6 feet off the ground, which is currently barred under state and federal law, with those limited exceptions again. And there were some, quote unquote guardrails added to the legislation, ostensibly to protect minors on the job. But there were a lot of, or there were definitely a few folks who work in the trades, some organized with the AFL-CIO's Working Families Lobby Corps, that said that these weren't enough to protect kids from health and safety risks on the job. And then I also did some reporting just on the lack of enforcement in the state in general when it comes to child labor law. So the state of Florida itself just has 7 employees dedicated to enforcing child labor law. And then there's the federal government, which also has pretty limited capacity for a state where there are, I think, an estimated like tens of thousands of teens in the workforce. And even on that side too, Florida also lacks the state labor department, which was abolished under then Governor Jeb Bush in the early 2000s. And one of the things that department did was combat wage theft. And we haven't really gotten a good replacement for that. And we know that construction is an industry that sees one of the highest rates of not only child labor violations, but also wage theft.
Hey, 5 seconds. Just wanted to say that this is only possible because of our donors. If you want to see more of this, then consider donating yourself at tvlr.fm/donate.
What about HB 49? Did that one pass as well? And what was in that?
Yeah, so that bill was passed mostly along party lines. So all Democrats were against it, and I think there was one Republican in the Florida House who opposed it. But that bill is the one that got the most attention. It was filed first, and that bill allows parents to sign a consent form and give permission for their 16 or 17-year-old child to work more than 30 hours per week during the school year. It also allows minors 16 and up to work more than 8 hours a day on holidays and Sundays during the school year, and adds a carve out from restrictions on hours for minors 16 and older who are homeschooled or enrolled in a virtual education program. And House Bill 49 was significantly watered down as well. And specifically where that started. So House Bill 49 would have kind of gutted restrictions, work and hour restrictions pretty broadly for 16 and 17-year-olds to essentially treat them as adult workers. And currently under law, minors aren't allowed to work over 30 hours per week during the school year, and there are stricter regulations for kids under 16. And then there was also an effort to preempt local governments from passing anything that's more restrictive in their communities. So it was kind of like stripped down ultimately, due to, again, a lot of public feedback. And there was a lot of media attention again on where that bill came from, because both of these child labor bills should be always emphasized, in my opinion, is just kind of like who's working on these things behind the scenes. So HB 49 came from the Foundation for Government Accountability, which is a Florida-based think tank that's historically lobbied for laws designed to undermine anti-poverty programs like SNAP and Medicaid, and also make it harder to obtain unemployment assistance. They support defunding public education and have lobbied in favor of anti-union legislation. But the Washington Post reported last April, I believe, that the FGA was a driving force behind child labor rollbacks in a number of states. So seeing that they're based in Florida, it honestly made a lot of sense for that kind of push to come here. Then the other bill, Senate Bill 460, that was a collaboration between the Florida Home Builders Association and the Associated Builders and Contractors of Florida, all according to public records I got. So email communications, in some cases text messages that were obtained through a public records request. And those two industry groups for the construction bill, those are two pretty major lobbying forces representing thousands of construction companies, home builders across the state. They're also state affiliates of national organizations that have supported child labor rollbacks in other states as well, according to some tracking from the Economic Policy Institute. So again, that wasn't really surprising either, although all parties involved there really tried to downplay the child labor stuff throughout the whole session.
Right. What were some of those? What was the communications that I noticed that you put on Twitter? Was that associated with this child labor bill?
So I got public records for quite a bit of legislation, but for both of those bills, yeah, I did get emails and text messages specifically for HB 49. Those were kind of interesting, but yeah, so there's a paper trail, and that's been kind of nice to be able to provide in our reporting, literally just kind of screenshots of these emails. And I'm happy to also kind of share those public records with anybody who wants them, because again, these are public, so you can request them, and there was no cost associated with it. So I think it's just that's not always the case. Sometimes agencies, state and local governments will try to pretty much provide these records at a cost that is unaffordable, especially for newsrooms, or I shouldn't say especially for newsrooms, but definitely local ones, but especially for like individuals, if you're not even associated with the media. But yeah, I did put on Twitter some of these screenshots about the emails that I received regarding.
I just want to say I really appreciate you, uncovering stuff like that and really, making clear where this is coming from, because I do think that's important. It's worth us knowing who is pushing these bills, right? Yeah. Because it's not just like some legislator cooked this up, in their own imagination. I mean, occasionally I'm sure that happens, but there are clear special interests that are working to push clear agendas.
Right. So last year there was a law passed affecting public sector unions in the state of Florida. Can you give us a recap of what that law did, what its effects have been this year, and the new and updated bill that passed that's going to be amending the one that passed last year?
Right, yeah. So the union legislation, there was some legislation that was filed this year that is essentially a follow-up to last year's really sweeping anti-union law, which the big things that did, that prohibited most public employees from having, or public sector union members, I should say, from having union dues automatically deducted from their paychecks. And established a minimum 60% threshold for most public sector unions. So, and I say most because the legislation largely exempted unions representing sworn law enforcement officers, firefighters, correctional, and probation officers, which generally endorse and support Republicans for elected office, throw campaign cash at them, all that stuff.
Right.
So under the new law, at least 60% of workers in those non-exempted unions that the union represents must also be dues-paying members. So at the same time that you're requiring more workers to pay union dues, you're also making it more difficult for them to do it. And I know a lot of union leaders, especially teachers unions, have been pretty open about just the challenge there, specifically them losing members just because they had to figure out a new way for people to pay dues in a way that was fast enough to be able to transition people over and to find a method that members actually felt comfortable with too, as far as the financial security, those kinds of maintaining privacy, that kind of stuff. And so the effects of that bill, for months, there wasn't a lot to kind of report as far as the effects, because there was a pretty sweeping, there was a pretty long rulemaking process just to kind of figure out how to implement it. But what essentially happened, so under the new law, if a union doesn't have at least 60% membership, they have a couple of things can happen. So one, they can petition for a recertification election, and during that time, the contract, if they have one, is still in place and the bargaining unit is still intact. They have to do that within 30 days of getting a notice from the state that, oh, hey, you're at risk for decertification because we saw that you have less than 60% membership. But the other thing that can happen, which I really didn't learn about until kind of within the past few months, or I hadn't really thought it could happen or would happen, is that a union can also, if they submit their annual registration renewal paperwork showing that they have less than 60% membership and they don't petition for recertification, they can also just be decertified. So petitioning for an election requires signatures from at least 30% of workers, and getting that 30% can be a challenge for some units with some barriers, including units that have like literally tens of thousands of employees, or units where membership was already like pretty dismally low. And then a union must again petition for recertification within 30 days of receiving that notice from the state. So unfortunately, what I saw and learned was that this was considered too great a challenge for over 40 bargaining units and counting that have since been decertified. So they either tried to gather those petitions and were unsuccessful, or in some cases, it appears that they didn't try at all, which is really devastating and was kind of difficult to report, honestly. And most of these bargaining units decertified so far without any sort of election are AFSCME units, representing blue-collar workers for cities and counties, as well as blue and white-collar workers at public universities, so including some of the biggest in the state. The teachers' unions have been fighting this pretty hard. They were already required under state law passed in 2018 to maintain at least 50% membership, and that was specifically aimed at those K through 12 education unions. So they were a little bit more prepared to survive this new membership requirement because nobody else had any sort of threshold before that in the public sector.
Right.
So that's kind of like the effects of that so far. And I'm still kind of keeping tabs on the decertifications that are still coming in, because I first reported on the kind of first major purge of that early February, but then last month there were also, I think, 3 more decertifications at least. So it's still happening, and it's going to keep happening, imagine. But then there are also a lot of unions that have petitioned for recertification, particularly those teacher unions that didn't reach the 60%.
So one of the bad things about this is that automatically, once you're decertified, your contract is null. And something that Chris Townsend asked last time he was on was, are any of the counselors of these municipalities, where, a lot of these municipalities are controlled by Democrats, are any of the municipalities where units are being decertified, are they any of them making commitments to to continue to adhere to the contract?
I haven't seen anything about that. I think that's a really interesting idea and a really interesting proposal. One thing I did find when I was doing my reporting was there was a school district kind of near the Daytona Beach area where one of their AFSCME units, or their only AFSCME unit, I should say, was decertified. And when I reached out to them to ask about that, kind of like that issue, like, are you going to still honor the contract? Because I think it was still workers there had a contract that was supposed to last either through, I think it was supposed to expire later this year. And they said that they would continue to honor the terms of the contract, at least through the end of that. And then they confirmed that after that, that's it. But there was one local university, the University of Central Florida, and I posed to them the same question, and they said no. They're just like, so you don't have this contract anymore. They sent an email to all their employees, pretty much kind of laying it all out, like, hey, so the union's been decertified and you had this contract and now you don't. And that was kind of it, which was honestly kind of shocking to see. But I haven't seen anything as far as from like local government leaders, although I think I haven't seen that kind of locally yet because there haven't been any local government unions that have been decertified, although there are a couple at risk. I think some LIUNA units have sort of gotten those initial warnings from the state regulating agency, PERC, which is the Public Employees Relations Commission. So I'm keeping an eye on that, but I haven't seen any elsewhere. I think there were some city workers in Jacksonville, more in like North, and also some places in South Florida that their units were decertified.
Right. And so what did the bill updating this law do?
Yeah, so that brings us back to this year's legislation. It definitely didn't get a lot of media attention just because it wasn't as sweeping. It was more focused on fixing some technical and procedural issues that came up from the implementation and rulemaking process of last year's bill. That's probably the most generous way to describe it. It's like fixing the confusion around things that the bill sponsors apparently didn't catch last year. So another way to describe it, based on conversations I've had and public records I've pulled on that legislation as well, is that the bill is designed largely to address complaints from the fire and police unions that were supposed to be exempted from most of the new regulations. So what happened there is, like, during the rulemaking process last year, there was some confusion about which bargaining units were actually exempted, because there are some units that, for instance, contained paramedics in addition to firefighters or EMTs and such in the police bargaining units. So even the state regulating agency, PERC, which is led by DeSantis appointees, they were like, well, I don't think you're exempted after all. You're going to have to follow the new rules like everybody else. And
Wow.
that got the cop and firefighter unions fired up, and they were lobbying the bill sponsors from last year, who also sponsored this year's legislation. Neither of whom, they haven't been union members ever themselves, but they were lobbied to make some changes. So emails I got through a records request also show that a couple of out-of-state anti-union think tanks, so the Freedom Foundation based in Washington and the Mackinac Center based in Michigan, were also collaborating on some requests around this, and they sent draft legislation essentially to accomplish what did get passed this year, as well as some, honestly, a really interesting and extensive list of legislative priorities that didn't make it into the legislation this year at all at any point. So that's something I'm going to be definitely keeping an eye on in future sessions. But also I'm curious to see if they're going to pop up in other state legislatures, since these are think tanks that do kind of just like send this draft language to state legislators in different parts of the country, not just Florida, similar to like the FGA with the child labor bill and stuff. But
yeah, I'm
but what
curious
did
how many they've sent to Alabama. I'm sure they've sent some stuff down here. So yeah, that would be interesting to find out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, no, I mean, honestly, if anybody sees some of these kind of public sector union laws popping up in different state legislatures, if you want to give me a shout out, and I will like look into that, because there are definitely some things that, again, like didn't make it into this year's law in Florida that could very well, it's possible they're being pitched elsewhere. So I think already I saw in Louisiana there's a new pretty sweeping anti-union law targeting public sector unions that included some language that honestly seemed pretty similar to what I saw when I got those public records. So for instance, one thing this new bill in Louisiana, I think, is trying to do is to restrict certain activities that unions can engage in. And I was kind of comparing like the language there to what I got from the Freedom Foundation, the Mackinac Center, through that records request. And there was a lot of like similar things popping up. So it was kind of a similar proposal there. So
Right.
if anybody sees anything and wants to know if and wants to see those public records, just like let me know, and I will, do what I can to try and kind of help you sort of compare, I guess, or see if
Right.
maybe there could be some of these groups behind that. But
I think that probably here in Alabama, we're not going to see much of that because, unfortunately, we already don't have any collective bargaining systems set up in the state of Alabama. So, and dues deductions have already been taken away from all unions except teachers, firefighters, and cops. Is that right, Adam? Do teachers still have dues deductions?
Teachers do have dues deductions, but there were restrictions similar to what you mentioned. There were restrictions placed on the activities that they could do, what they called political activity. And so that was tied up in court for years on what exactly that meant. The AEA had to do bank draft and credit card draft for like a couple of years. So they went through that experience and then they got the payroll dues deduction back. But yeah, all that to say, I guess the baseline foundation right now in Alabama is already so bad. There's not a lot of room to make it worse. But if there's any attempts, I think we'll know where it's coming from for sure. And I gotta say, it's shocking that we've got, I think you said 40 unions decertified. That is remarkable. And I hope that the leaders of the labor movement across the country are really paying attention to this, because this is something that could hit their state. And it's also important as a movement that we don't leave Florida behind, right? Like if we have spare organizers anywhere, like time to bust them out and send them down south to Florida, honestly.
Yeah.
Yeah, on that point, I do have a tiny bit of good news, and that's something I found yesterday, or I learned yesterday, is that there were actually a couple of AFSCME units that did go through the recertification process, and they had their elections, and workers voted unanimously to keep those bargaining units intact.
Nice.
So, and that's the first I've seen. There's been a lot of elections scheduled, but because the state regulating agency is so backlogged, I haven't heard of any other elections where unions have been recertified, but that was like the first kind of victory. And those were two pretty small bargaining units. One was literally 3 employees, and then another was, I think, 108. But that's still a bit of good news on that front. And I think a lot of the teachers unions specifically too will also, once they actually get to vote, I think the hardest part for some of these units is just getting that recertification, getting those petitions and those signatures to be able to petition for an election. But I think a lot of these workers, when they get the chance to vote, it's going to be, we're going to see less. We're not, I guess I expect to see a lot of units vote to keep the unions intact. So
right, absolutely. And I think, and that's got to be the key, and I think there's got to be a lot of internal organizing going on to help make sure that happens. So, and I know that takes resources, right? And that's part of the point of doing this, is to drain the unions of resources. So, but yeah, I really appreciate your reporting on this. I think it's a big story for labor nationally to pay attention to what's happening in Florida.
Yeah. McKenna Schueler, staff reporter for the Orlando Weekly. Really appreciate what you're doing down there and for taking the time to talk to us about it.
Yeah, thanks so much. I really love coming on here, and it's great to talk to you guys.
Yep.
Yeah, appreciate it. Keep up the good work.
Yep, talk soon.
Thanks.
You just saw a clip from the Valley Labor Report. We are live every Saturday morning from 9:30 a.m. till 12:30 p.m. And we pride ourselves on keeping all of our content free to to everybody so that we can talk to as many working folks as possible. If you support the work that we're doing, you think that it's important, you think that it's good, then consider making a monthly contribution to the project, and you can do that on our website, tvlr.fm.